Strange Tales Told by a Dubliner. Be Turlough con me. Story number 7. Lord Belvedere's murder. I went to school at a place called Belvedere. So did James Joyce, Harry Clark, and other Dublin luminaries. It was a school run by the Jesuits. Now, the Jesuits always gave the name of some Jesuit saint to their colleges, but in this case, the building they had acquired was called Belvedere House, and so the name Belvedere stayed as the name of the college. When you walk up the stone steps from the street to the massive wooden door, you see a large brass plate inscribed with the words Belvedere College S.J. All I knew when I was going there as a boy was that the house had been built in the later 18th century as the townhouse of an Anglo-Irish nobleman called Lord Belvedere. The Jesuits bought it as a site for a school in 1841. Now, there was an irony in all of this, which we pupils of the Jesuits didn't entirely recognise. After the triumph of the Reformation in Renaissance England, Catholic priests were hunted and persecuted, and no one more than the Jesuits, who were considered to be secret agents of the Pope. When the last Catholic king, James II, was deposed, it ushered in a century of persecution and discrimination against Catholics, which had a devastating effect in Ireland. The traditional elites had to go to the continent for a Catholic education. Meanwhile, they were deprived of their estates and replaced by Protestant English or Anglo-Irish lords. When the period of the penal laws finally ended at the beginning of the 19th century, the Jesuits and others were readmitted to the British dominions and were allowed to found schools with a view to educating those of their own persuasion. The Jesuits had a clear plan in view. They wanted to build up an educational elite among the Catholic population that would be able to hold their own against the English Protestant aristocracy. One of the first schools they founded in Ireland was Belvedere College. Their educational ideal was now no longer that of the traditional Jesuit schools on the continent. Instead, it was a shameless imitation of the English public schools like Eton and Harrow, with their cult of the well-bred gentleman who knew the classics and engaged in the manly sports which had won the British Empire. We absorbed this unspoken ethos in the classroom and on the playing field, and even ended up believing in it, though most young fellows like me hardly qualified as gentlemen. By the time I was going there in the 1960s, the Jesuits had managed to build a whole school with junior and senior houses around the quadrangle at the back of Belvedere House, which latter was now used mainly as a residence for the Jesuits themselves. So we pupils didn't go in there much. I just have a recollection of a rather gloomy 18th century mansion with wide stairways and some reception rooms with stucco ornamentation on the ceilings, which were used for meetings. Yet in the middle of the school buildings that had sprung up in the course of a century, there remained this relic of the English ascendancy, Belvedere House, a monument to an elite of days gone by, the grace and authority of which we could hardly claim to aspire to. It was like a ghost from an earlier time among other buildings in the school complex. Many years later, I heard that Belvedere House was supposed to be haunted. It was haunted by the ghost of the First Lady Belvedere, who had had a tragic life. But I never knew about this or the story of the Belvedere family. I certainly saw no ghosts there in the years I was a pupil at Belvedere. All me life I've wondered ironically at the name Belvedere. It's an Italian word, of course, Belvedere, and it refers to a building or vantage point from which a fine view is to be had. Now, this was certainly not true of Belvedere College. It was just a building looking out on other buildings in a rather run-down quarter of the city, though when it was built it must have had better views. But I knew that the name comes from a previous owner, who was the son of the first Lord Belvedere. I'll tell you the first Earl's rather gruesome story, which explains why Belvedere House is supposed to be haunted by the ghost of his widow. That story took place long before Belvedere House was built. Robert Rochfort, the first Earl of Belvedere, came from a long-established Anglo-Irish family. They were originally Rochfort, for they were Normans by origin. They had their seat in County Westmeath, where they had a large country house. Robert Rochfort married quite young in the year 1731, but his first wife soon died of smallpox. In 1738 he married again, his bride being Mary Molesworth, the daughter of a local Anglo-Irish family, who was only 16 at the time. She was artistically inclined, loved the theatre, and was already known in creative circles in Dublin. The Rochforts had 3 children, but in 1743 it emerged that Mary, no doubt bored and isolated at the country house in Westmeath, was having an intrigue with Robert's own younger brother, Arthur. It was now that the extreme vindictiveness that was a part of Robert Rochfort's character became clear. He sued his younger brother Arthur for crim con, criminal conversation, the legal term for adultery at the time, and obtained very substantial damages which Arthur could not pay. So he fled the country to avoid being put in debtor's prison. As for Mary, there was talk of transporting her to the colonies, but in the end the court consigned her to her husband to dispose of her as he wished. Under the legal system then, she was only a chattel. Robert proceeded to imprison her at the family seat, depriving her of society and even her children. After a few years, Arthur returned to Ireland under an assumed name and laid plans to rescue Mary from her imprisonment and elope with her to the continent. He got word to Mary of his return, and she managed to escape from the country house in County Westmeath. But her own father would not give her sanctuary, and soon she was found and brought back to her prison. What was more, Arthur was captured too, and cast into debtor's prison in Dublin. After her attempt at escape from her imprisonment, her ladyship was subjected to even harsher restrictions by her vindictive husband, egged on by his other brother, George. For a total of 31 years, she was locked away in a section of her own home. She was assigned servants to attend her, but they functioned as prison guards more than anything else. They were to supervise her walks. They were instructed not to speak to her. She never saw her own children. She was allowed to walk only in the long gallery of the house. As with other aristocratic houses, this space was lined with family portraits. The deceased ancestors of the Rochfort family thus looked down on her, not her own. But there is an indication that she found their gaze on her to be kindly rather than reproachful. Eventually, the forsaken countess made a virtue of necessity and began to converse with these portrait figures. She seemed to adopt them one by one as her personal friends. Accompanied by her stern, mute servants, she progressed around the gallery and paused for a conversation with each framed ancestor of the Rochforts. Her voice, it was said, had become strange and almost human, like a sustained whisper or the chattering of a small bird. When she conversed with the portraits, it was this residual voice that echoed around the gallery, a ghost of a voice, suitable for a conversation with the ghosts of the dead. Perhaps these ghosts became real to her ladyship. Perhaps they visited her in dreams and consoled her with accounts of their own lives, not always glorious, not always triumphant, despite the uniforms and court dress in which they were portrayed. Perhaps in her own dreams in the dead of night she arose, the locks and doors of her imprisonment opened, and she could wander alone up and down the ancestors' gallery. At such times, the massive gilt frames of the portraits were empty, and the splendidly dressed company were assembled on the polished floors, waiting only for her to arrive, the rightful mistress of the house. They turned to her and smiled as she glided through the doors and down the gallery, bowing and curtsying to her silently. There was the first Rochfort who had come over with the Normans and established himself in Ireland. He stepped forward in glinting armour and said to her, "Soyez la bienvenue parmi nous ce soir, madame." Then there were all the succeeding generations, husbands, wives, and sometimes their children. They crowded around and said in their various voices, "God save you, lady." Finally, there was a man in modern dress, who bowed and said, "I am glad to see your ladyship this night, as always, for know that in spite of all that has happened, you are one of us, a Rochfort, and always will be." As he spoke, his face wore a pained expression, and she knew him for George Rochfort, her father-in-law. In his lifetime, he had lived in this house, and had welcomed as a visitor Jonathan Swift, whose friend he had been. Perhaps these were ghosts who had risen from their graves or stepped out of their portraits at midnight. Lady Belvedere was forbidden all contact with the living, so perhaps she had developed the power of summoning the dead to her presence and holding converse with them. She was already little more than a ghost herself, the ghost of the woman she had once been. The servants were sure enough that she had lost her sanity. To anyone who caught a glimpse of her, she was a figure to strike fear into a normal man or woman. The blooming bride of 16 had shriveled into a thin, emaciated figure, pale as a living corpse. She wore the clothes that had been in fashion 20 or 30 years before. And then this voice that had lost the semblance of everything human, this dry, rasping whisper. Surely she belonged to the world of the dead, not the world of the living. All this was understandable, of course, if one knew about her long solitary imprisonment, which was enough to break the strongest spirit. Robert Rochfort, now styled Earl of Belvedere, remained as vindictive as ever against his wife and his younger brother. Not for nothing was he known to all and sundry as the Wicked Earl. At some point he even turned against his brother George, who had encouraged his vindictiveness against his wife Mary. George had built himself a magnificent mansion, which all found so elegant as to put Robert's own country house in the shade. The new building was visible from the Earl's mansion. Robert was outraged at what he perceived as this affront. He decided to build a structure on his own land, which would obscure the view of George's house. It was to be a folly, that is, a building that served no purpose, but expressed the whim of the landowner. This folly turned out to be an imitation of a ruined abbey, such was left over after the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII at the time of the Reformation. Old monastic foundations were either left in ruins or were given to English lords as a reward for their loyalty at that time. Many of these were renovated and made into country houses by their new owners, often retaining the word abbey in their name. The imitation ruin, built by Robert Rochfort, was a tall, imposing structure. Because of the story of the rival brothers attached to it, it became known as the Jealous Wall. It has stood there ever since, even though the grand houses on either side of it have been renovated, sold, or demolished over the past 2.5 centuries. Meanwhile, the luckless Mary continued to be imprisoned in the family mansion in County Westmeath, and Arthur languished in debtor's prison in Dublin until he died there in 1774. Shortly thereafter, however, mysterious events took place at the family seat, which led to the sudden death of Lord Belvedere. It was immediately suspected he had been murdered, but no culprit was ever found. It was a calm, fine evening in the autumn of 1774. The dinner had been served, followed by brandy and good tobacco, and Lord Belvedere, now 66 years of age, took his usual constitutional in the gardens at the side of the country house, overlooking Loch Ennell, a long shallow lake of County Westmeath. The lake was calm, and scarcely a wind caused it to ripple. The days were getting shorter as the year advanced. A pale full moon rose over the land, illuminating many features. Naught was to be heard but the hooting of distant owls in the woods along the shore. It was then that Lord Belvedere saw something out on the lake. It was a small boat, and it seemed to be making for the jetty of Belvedere House. This aroused a strange sense of foreboding in the noble lord. He determined to see who was coming to visit him at this late hour, unannounced. As he walked down towards the jetty, he heard the splash of oars in the water. The boat was approaching, and in it was a solitary oarsman. Lord Belvedere stood on the jetty now, watching the boat come alongside. He could not tell who the oarsman was, for he was dressed in a dark cloak and a dark broad-brimmed hat that was pulled down over his eyes. The boat touched the wooden piles and stairs of the jetty, and the man threw out a rope around a post to steady the boat. He stood up in the boat. "Who are you there?" asked Lord Belvedere unsteadily. The man took off his hat. "Arthur!" cried Lord Belvedere in astonishment. "Is it you? But it can't be you. You're dead." Arthur nodded grimly, but made no further reply. After a few moments of silence had passed, Arthur said, "Get in the boat." "No," said Robert, beginning to be assailed by panic. "I won't. I don't want to. I don't know why you've come here." "I've come here to put an end to this whole sorry business, Robert. It's the only way. Now, get in the boat." Robert trembled all over, but he seemed to be in a hypnotic trance. "Haven't you obeyed the commands?" of the other man. He walked unsteadily down the steps of the jetty and got into the boat. Arthur steadied him with one hand. Robert shivered, feeling the icy hand that held his arm. "My God," groaned Robert, "your touch is so cold." "As well it might be," said Arthur. "Sit down now." Robert sat down in the boat facing his brother. Arthur released the painter from the post on the jetty and stowed it in the bottom of the boat. Then he gripped the oars and rowed in a circle so that the boat was again facing the far end of the loch. The two men were silent for a long time. "Where are you taking me?" gasped Robert as he watched the lights of Belvedere House recede in the distance. "Where are we going?" "We are going where I have come from," said Arthur. "To the other side." At Belvedere House, the servants were perturbed to see that Lord Belvedere had not come back from his evening constitutional. Reasoning that he met an acquaintance on his walk and had gone off with him for a late-night carouse or to play cards, they prepared his bed in the usual way and then went to bed themselves. All was quiet and dark at Belvedere House when the boat with the single oarsman again arrived. No one saw as he silently tied up the boat at the jetty and walked up the wooden path to the gardens. No one heard his footfalls as the figure in the dark cloak and broad-brimmed hat advanced up through the gardens and entered the house through the French windows at the side. Nor did the sleeping servants hear him as he strode through the empty halls and up the wide staircase till he reached the garret at the top of the house. Lady Belvedere awoke from an unquiet sleep to find a man in a dark cloak and a broad-brimmed hat pulled down over his eyes standing just inside the door of her bedroom. She shivered with dread. But then the man took off his hat and stepped into a pool of moonlight that shone through the skylight in the roof. "Arthur," she said in a hoarse whisper, "is this a dream or is it you?" "It is no dream, dearest," said Arthur, his long familiar voice seeming to come from far away. "It is I." She got up and went to him. She wanted to be held in his embrace, but the air around him was as cold as ice, so she stood undecidedly. "Have you come then to take me away with you?" she asked. "No," said Arthur sadly. "We two cannot be together now. But I have come to tell you that you are free. The Wicked Earl is no more. I have seen to it. It was the only way to end this tyranny. Now I must go, and be gone before the night has ended, before the alarm is raised. But you, wait patiently for your deliverance." He stepped back into the shadows, turned, and was gone. The next morning, the servants knew for sure that something was wrong, for Lord Belvedere had not reappeared. His bed had not been slept in. Messengers were dispatched to the nearby houses of the gentry to inquire if he had gone there, but to no avail. They were now very anxious about his whereabouts and his welfare, because he'd quarrelled with many men and had many enemies in Westmeath, and someone might have settled a score with him by stealth. By the late afternoon, they put out a boat to search Lough Ennel, and just before dark, a body was seen floating out on the waters of the lake. When they pulled it in, they recognised it as Lord Belvedere. He was dead, presumably by drowning. There was also a wound on his head, seemingly from a blow with a heavy object, such as an oar. How he had got out there, no one could tell. As the death was suspicious and foul play likely, the officers of the law in Westmeath were informed. They came and investigated. The servants were able to tell them little, except that Lord Belvedere had gone on his usual after-dinner walk, down through the gardens and the wooded path to the lake, as he usually did, but that he had not returned. The local tenants on the estate told them, however, of a boat that had crossed Lough Ennel after dark and had landed at the jetty of Belvedere House. It had been seen out on the lake not once, but twice or several times that night. They had heard the sound of the boat's oars in the silence of the countryside. Yes, there were men in the boat, but whether there were two or several, they couldn't tell for sure. The story grew up that a group of murderers had crossed Lough Ennel in the boat, lain in wait for the hapless Earl, murdered him, and thrown his body in the lake as they rowed away, and made their escape. But no such group of men was ever identified. In the end, Lord Belvedere's sudden death was recorded as an unsolved murder. The first Lord Belvedere was succeeded in the title by his eldest son George, who had grown up unable to see his mother in her imprisonment, for the Wicked Earl had determined that she was to be deprived of her children. George went to the family seat in Westmeath and immediately restored his mother to freedom. When he marched up the stairs to the top of the house and had the garret unlocked and the doors thrown open by the servants, she came out and looked at her son, not recognising him, for he was now a grown man and she'd never been allowed to see him. But she seemed already aware of what had happened, for she asked, "Is the tyrant dead?" It was, alas, a melancholy deliverance, for it was clear that the long years of imprisonment had affected Lady Belvedere's reason. She spoke in a strange, shrill whisper, and she made use of her newfound freedom to wander about the halls of the mansion, addressing soliloquies to the portraits of the Rochfort family hanging in the galleries, including the portrait of the Wicked Earl himself, who had caused her so much suffering. George Rochfort decided to take his mother away from this accursed house in order to preserve what was left of her reason. In the year 1775, he married. He was now over 30 years of age and was still a bachelor. His two brothers never married. It seems their traumatic upbringing was enough to put them all off the married state. At any rate, George Rochfort and his new wife decided to build a townhouse in Dublin, on a plot of land that had been previously acquired by the first Earl for that very purpose. In the meantime, they went to England and the continent for 2 years, and Mary, Lady Belvedere, accompanied them on their travels. On their return to Ireland, they settled in the new Belvedere House in Dublin, Mary, Lady Belvedere, lived there with them. It was her last home. She died in 1785. When her son, George Rochfort, the second Earl, died in 1814, he was without issue, and his peerage became extinct. Belvedere House lay vacant and was eventually acquired by the Jesuits for their new school. For whatever reason, the ghost of Lady Belvedere is supposed to haunt Belvedere House to this day. Perhaps her ghost feels bound to Belvedere House in Dublin as the place of better times, or merely because she died there. Perhaps she found it best to leave the country seat in Westmeath to the Wicked Earl, whose ghost has been reported from there, in fact. At least, there have always been strange and inexplicable events there. Knocking seems to be heard on a window. The smell of brandy and tobacco is smelt in rooms in the house. A kind of ghostly whistling is heard outside in the park. And after dark, an eerie feeling descends over the mansion and the park, which troubles visitors unaccountably. It is even said that if you go down to the shore of Loch Ennel, you'll see a figure in a small boat who seems to be waiting offshore and then disappears. Yet, from the time of her deliverance to her leaving the place of her imprisonment for good, Lady Belvedere had already haunted the country seat in Westmeath, apostrophising the Rochfort family portraits in her shrill whisper, hardly meant for human ears. Having haunted one house as a living ghost, perhaps she chose to haunt a better one as a spirit from beyond the grave. You have been listening to Lord Belvedere's Murder by Turlough Conmee from Strange Tales Told by a Dubliner. If you've enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, share and comment. And so, until next time.